So in my previous theory crafting build video, I went over a ordnance or grenade focused build for Rafa that was focused on the blue skill tree using the Apothis Lance ability. In this video, we're going to be going over another ordnance and grenade focused Rafa build, but this is going to be focused on the green tree using the arc knife's action skill. And this one is going to have a lot of the same focus on grenades and ordnance, but it's going to play quite a bit differently than that first build video. So we should start off with Rafa's trait, which is Overdrive. Whenever Rafa activates an action skill, he enters Overdrive. And when the action skill is active, Overdrive does not have a duration, but it lasts 12 seconds after your action skill ends, and it gives you 10% damage and 25% movement speed at a baseline. So just a big buff around your action skill usage. And the action skill we're using is arc knives. Rafa puts down his guns and equips arc knives. So he gets 2 big knives on each hand. This also puts you in third person the whole time you're in it. Blades that deal melee damage and mark enemies. So every time you melee someone, it puts a stacking mark on them wherever they damage them, causing them to take increased damage from every mark on them. So at a baseline, you hit enemies, it marks them, they take more damage for every mark on them. And one of his abilities is you perform melee attacks with the knives. Another ability is dash forward and perform a shock melee attack. So now you have a dash. Then another one of the abilities is unleash Rafa's Blade Fury, which deals shock damage to all marked enemies and ends the skill. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the big spinning AoE attack, but I could be wrong about that. But that last ability is essentially like the ultimate and the thing that ends the skill if the duration hasn't ended yet. So you essentially just want to mark up a bunch of enemies, then you do his Blade Fury, which I think spins, does a bunch of damage, removes the marks while doing all that damage, and then ends the skill. So you have a good amount of control around what you're doing with the skill, especially being able to end it with the big AoE portion of it. But that brings us into our nodes, starting with Midnight Oil. Rafa's action skills deal bonus corrosive damage. The longer the skill has been active, the greater the bonus damage. So it's 2% per second. I'm assuming this goes up to 10% per second. And keep in mind, this deals a bonus corrosive damage. So this isn't, it deals just like more corrosive damage that increases any corrosive damage you're dealing. Bonus means it's on top of anything else. So arc knives at a baseline are dealing all shock damage. So anytime you're doing shock damage with any part of your arc knife's action skill, it'll also be dealing some percentage bonus damage as a secondary damage number. So you will be dealing shock and corrosive just through the passive and your action skill. And because arc knives has a 32-second duration, if you don't use the ability that ends it, you can get really high damage stacking through Midnight Oil if you really want it. Then we have a Dial In. Whenever Rafa damages an enemy with a melee attack, his melee attacks gain critical strike damage. This chance stacks, and all stacks are removed whenever Rafa critically hits an enemy, and it's 3% per stack. Presumably at 5 points this is going to be 15%. So this is a secondary type of a stack. This isn't the marks you put on enemies from arc knives, but because you're meleeing them, however many marks they have is going to be how many stacks of Dial In they have until you critically hit, then it resets that. So you're basically building up to guarantee crits at some point, which is really strong for 2 additional passives. The first one being Saldar, which Rafa's melee critical hits gain lifesteal. Presumably this is going to be 25%. So anytime you crit with a melee, it gives you a bunch of lifesteal, and with it probably going up to 25% and your melee is probably dealing a lot of damage, you'll get a lot of healing based upon that if you need it. Now the other passive, just to skip a little bit, is going to be a Booming Business. When Rafa critically hits an enemy, he gains a chance to spawn a free grenade. If Rafa has a grenade equipped, spawn a grenade based on that. So now anytime you crit, it'll spawn a grenade at a 50% chance, 12-second cooldown. I'm not sure what putting more points into this does, if it increases the grenade chance or reduces the cooldown or does both. My presumption is that every new point reduces the cooldown of this and doesn't increase the chance. So it's like a 50% chance on a low cooldown on crits to spawn that grenade. So now we're building up this Dial In to guarantee crits, which will then give us a bunch of lifesteal and has a good chance to spawn a grenade on a lower cooldown, which depending on how quickly we build this up and build up our critical strike chance, we may just spawn a grenade on like every crit or every other crit. So it'll just be a bunch of additional grenades and other things. Now the rest of our points are going to be in this middle section here. We already went over booming business, but on the first row, we're taking collaborate ignition. So it's an overdrive skill. Rafa deals bonus damage of his weapons element with all skills and ordinances while overdrive is active. And at one point, it's 12% of weapons damage. So presuming that's going to be stacking with every point you put into this, but essentially whatever weapon is in your hand while overdrive is active will deal bonus damage of his weapons element to skills and ordinances. Now I'm presuming, even though it says weapons element, that weapons without elements on them will also just deal that bonus damage as non-elemental damage. I'm not 100% sure on that. It could be that you need an elemental weapon for this bonus damage, but again, this is bonus damage. So let's say you have a cryo weapon. This would mean that when overdrive is active, your skills and ordinances, so your grenades and your arc knife skill would both be dealing a bunch of bonus cryo damage based upon your weapons damage. Now, presumably, because this is based upon your weapons damage and a percentage of it, you would probably want to, most of the time, have in your hands a weapon with a really high base damage. I'm not sure if this would work off of like shotguns with like some amount of damage times 12 for the pellets, if that would count as just the damage without the pellets, or if it would actually count all the pellet damage, or if you would want to use like a sniper rifle with a really high single amount of damage. But you probably will be able to maximize this quite a bit by always making sure to have a really high damage weapon in your hands. And also keep in mind, this will be working when you're in arc knives because overdrive is active and it's a skill obviously, so it'll be dealing that bonus damage the whole time you're in arc knives. So you'll definitely always want to have that highest damage weapon in your hands when you activate, because it'll probably scale based upon the weapon that was in your hand when you activated the skill. So some really interesting scaling based off this skill. Then we have Artilleria. Rafa gains increased ordnance cooldown rate, and this is just a passive, over 50% ordnance cooldown rate, so you can just throw more and more grenades. And after we go over all of our passives, I'll talk about how I want this build to actually play and how I think this is going to play, because one of the things I didn't mention at the start of the video, which we will go over at the end, is that when you're in arc knives, based upon all the footage I've seen, you can't throw grenades when in arc knives, but we do have some things to play around that. But then finally, we have Hemolitions, another overdrive skill. While overdrive is active, Rafa may use grenades while cooling down at the cost of health. Every time a grenade is used this way, it costs more health until Rafa's grenade fully cools down. So it takes 10% of your current life. So essentially, when overdrive is active, which because we're using arc knives and it seems you can't throw a grenade when you're in it, it seems that the 12 seconds after your arc knives, you'll be able to throw infinite grenades, but after you don't have any charges of grenades left, it'll take 10% of your current life per grenade. Now, I haven't gone into this in this build. It would be really interesting to try a build where you try to take all of your health and turn it into shields, because presumably this can't kill you because it's percent of your current health. So if you have a super low life, you could just keep throwing these without a worry of dying, but you'd have a massive shield to keep you alive while having really low life. So there could be some really cool things with this. This is essentially just to spam out grenades before we go back in our action skill, which will be a big part of the build, and we'll go over that later in the video. And then we have our augment and our capstone, starting with our augment of parting gift. Whenever Rafa activates his dash attack, he leaves behind a grenade. If he has a grenade equipped, use that grenade instead. Enemies damaged by these grenades become marked. Now, what could possibly be really good with that part is if you have a grenade that maybe splits to a bunch of other grenades, is each one of those damage events going to add a mark? So if you have a grenade that splits into like 100 different little grenades that all damage something, will every single one of those apply a mark, or is it just that one grenade that would apply a mark once on its like first damage or something like that? And then whenever Rafa applies a mark to an enemy, apply an additional mark. So it's going to be incredibly strong for applying everything else, because keep in mind, marks make the enemies take increased damage. Then when you use our big blade flurry, it deals damage based upon all of the marks to those enemies. We have some other synergies with marks, so this is just going to be incredibly strong. And I'm not actually sure what the cooldown on his dash is going to be, but the dash seems like it's going to be able to be used a lot. So you will be able to use a lot of grenades because this also doesn't have a cooldown, it seems. And then for our capstone, we have Infernal Protocol. While arc knives are active, Rafa's exosuit stores all damage dealt to him. The exosuit then heats up and constantly does a small amount of fire damage to him. Additionally, Rafa's melee attacks deal bonus fire damage. Keep in mind, that's bonus. So again, just based off of our capstone, our arc knives, and our midnight oil, we're now doing 3 different different elemental damage types at once. We're dealing shock at a baseline, we're dealing the bonus corrosive from Midnight Oil, and then we're dealing bonus fire damage when Infernal Protocol is active, which should be basically at all times if he takes damage. And then also keep in mind, we also have the bonus of our weapons element damage, so we could have cryo on that. So we can be dealing 4 different damage types, 4 different elemental damage types from all of our action skill damage, which could be pretty crazy. And a portion of all damage dealt to Rafa is also dealt to enemies he has marked. So again, we're going to be running around meleeing, which marks enemies. We're going to be running around dashing, which will throw out grenades, which will then mark enemies. And then a portion of all damage we take is going to be dealt to those enemies marked. Now keep in mind, it's also, so this isn't a damage reduction for us. And then using Blade Flurry, which is our skill that takes us out of our action skill, causes Rafa to consume all stored damage and deals a bonus fire damage based on that stored damage. A portion of all damage dealt this way is returned to Rafa as health. So this is actually really cool. So basically, as you're taking damage, you're building up all this damage on yourself, which is dealing some fire damage to you, but your melee attacks are dealing bonus fire damage. Some of the damage you're taking is also being sent out to all marked enemies. Then when we use our big Blade Flurry, which will take us out of Arc Knives, it takes all that stored damage, deals bonus fire damage to all enemies based upon it, and returns a bunch of life based upon that. So it's going to be pretty crazy, but we are going to need healing because this constantly drains health from us. We should have enough healing through Solder because we're going to be critting a lot to keep ourselves alive. So this is just going to be a bunch of different elements mixed together. And even though it's an ordnance build, our action skill is going to be pretty crazy because again, we're spawning a bunch of grenades while using our action skill. And then we have all of the different elements tied into our action skill. So this is just going to be a really interesting part of the build. And then that brings us to the rest of our points we're putting into the blue tree. So starting off, we have Rinse. Rafa gains increased reload speed, and then that goes into Preparado, which whenever Rafa reloads his current gun, he gains increased action skill cooldown rate, and this effect stacks. And it's at 4% here, but presumably it's going to go up per point. It has 100 stacks possible. Basically, what we're going to do when we're outside of Arc Knives is just spam reload to get back into it much more quickly. And then we have 5 points into Ariba, kill skill. Whenever Rafa kills an enemy, he gains increased ordnance cooldown rate. So this stacks up. Presumably it's going to be really high because 5 points into it has a duration of 12 seconds. So we just keep getting kills and we just stay with this massively reduced ordnance cooldown rate. Now that brings us into how I think this build is going to play based upon everything I've seen. So we went over that it seems when using Arc Knives, you can't use your ordnance slot when you're in it. So you can't be throwing grenades or anything. But we do know that especially with some legendary grenades, you can get a lot of grenade charges through some of those grenades. If you don't know how grenades work, grenades have a charge system. So let's say you have 2 charges, you throw one, you would still have a second charge, but because you have 2 charges, your cooldown is actually coming back on that 1 charge. So you're not wasting cooldowns and it just refreshes 1 charge at a time. But if you have say 10 charges, what we can do is throw all of our grenade charges, then jump into Arc Knives, be running around, throwing out grenades with our dash, doing all of our action skill damage, which it seems we're going to have like 4 different elements while we're doing all of that damage. And then when we want to, more specifically, probably when we have like all of our grenade charges, we will use our Blade Flurry. We will use our Blade Fury, which does all this big damage to enemies. It'll also deal a ton of damage based upon our capstone and give us a bunch of health back. So we're max life. We'll then be taken out of that. We can throw all of our grenade charges, and until we're back into Arc Knives, because of our passive at the bottom here, we can keep throwing even more grenades. It's going to be using our health instead of the grenade cooldowns when we run out. But while doing that, and when we're out of grenades and don't want to kill ourselves through this passive, we'll just be reloading a bunch to stack up our action skill cooldown rate from Preparado, using the increased reload speed from Rinse, which will probably want a really fast reloading weapon for this to get us back into our action skill much more quickly. So even though this is a grenade focused build, we actually just want to spam out all of our grenades when we're in combat very quickly and get back into our Arc Knives, because then in our Arc Knives we have it super buffed up with all of that extra elemental damage, and then we're just going to constantly be spawning even more grenades through our dash ability. So that's kind of how you're going to be playing it from all of the information I have. And just looking at the two versions of grenade / ordinance builds I've created for Rafa, one that was a blue tree focused grenade build, one that is now a green tree focused one, I'm really liking how many different options you have in the skill trees of Borderlands 4 before we even get into gear, because these two builds kind of have the same idea. They work a little bit differently, but they're kind of just focused on trying to buff up your grenades as much as possible, be able to throw as many and deal as much damage with them, but they work in kind of very different ways just by going a bit more into one tree than the other. So I'm very excited for how many builds we're going to be able to create. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.